The wind howled down the main street of Dry Creek, dragging dust across wooden planks and creaky storefronts. On a raised platform normally used for livestock auctions, a girl stood trembling, the folds of her dirt-streaked dress clinging to her like a second skin. Her name was Josie Harper, and today she was the spectacle. The townsfolk had gathered not out of need but out of morbid curiosity. Their eyes gleamed with cruelty, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Josie didn't look up. She couldn't. Every glance felt like another slap, every chuckle a nail in the coffin of her dignity, her so-called crime being an orphan. And worse, one with a crooked leg and a sharp tongue. The town had never forgiven her for surviving when others hadn't. Now she was being reassigned, sold off to pay for her upkeep. At the edge of the platform stood Mayor Rutledge, a man as oily as the cigar between his teeth. He gestured toward Josie with a grin too wide to be real. "Not your typical prize, gentleman," he called, "but she's healthy, young, and I'm sure someone here's got work she can handle." The crowd roared and Josie's hands clenched at her sides. She swallowed down the tears. She would not give them that. Not today. Then a voice, cool and steady, cut through the noise. "How much?" The crowd turned startled. A man stood alone near the watering trough, Cash Mercer. A rancher most folks whispered about, but few dared cross, tall, sun-browned, with a look like stone worn by years of wind and grief. He hadn't stepped into town for months. Mayor Rutledge blinked, thrown off. "Mercer, didn't think this was your kind of business." "It ain't," Cash replied, "but I'll take her." $10, Rutledge said quickly, sensing his moment slipping. Cash only. Without a word, Cash pulled a small pouch from his saddlebag and tossed it onto the mayor's boots. The coins jingled sharp in the silence. Josie finally raised her head, eyes locking with his. There was no pity there, just a quiet certainty that unsettled her even more than the laughter. "You'll come with me," he said, not cruelly, just final. For a moment Josie stood frozen, then slowly she stepped off the platform and followed the man who had bought her not as property she dared to hope, but maybe as something else. Not rescue, not love, just the beginning of not being alone. The sun had long since dipped beneath the hills. When Cash Mercer rode through the narrow canyon trail toward his ranch, a silent figure hunched behind him on the saddle, Josie Harper. She hadn't spoken since the auction, not even when he offered her the canteen or pointed out the mountain ridge that marked his land. He didn't push her. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was wounded. Cash wasn't used to company, not since the fire, not since he buried his wife and the little girl she never got to meet. The cabin he'd built with his own hands had grown cold with grief, its walls echoing only with the sounds of wind and memory. Josie was the first soul to cross his threshold in over a year. He showed her the pantry, the cot by the stove, and the wash basin on the porch. "You'll be safe here," he said. She didn't answer, only nodded, her eyes flicking toward the corners of the room as if expecting some hidden cruelty to reveal itself. That first night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. The days that followed were filled with cautious rhythms. Cash kept to his chores, mending fence posts, tending his few head of cattle, chopping firewood. Josie watched quiet as a rabbit. But he noticed small things. She swept the floor without being asked. She folded his old shirts and left them on the table. Once he caught her humming softly while scrubbing the hearth, a song too old for someone so young. She was used to fear, that much was clear. When a hawk cried overhead or a branch snapped underfoot, her whole body tensed. She flinched when he raised his voice at a stubborn mule. But each time Cash would pause, not apologizing, just softening. He began to speak more, pointing out constellations in the night sky or explaining how to tell if a calf was sick. One afternoon he found her in the back garden, or what used to be one, digging at the stubborn earth with her bare hands. The soil was dry, untouched for years. "You know that dirt's not likely to give you much," he said, leaning on his shovel. Josie shrugged, eyes still focused on the ground. "It doesn't have to be much, just enough." Cash said nothing, just handed her the hoe he hadn't used in seasons. That evening he left a tin of bean seeds beside her bowl of stew. It was a quiet offering. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It wasn't healing. But it was the start of something neither of them had dared to believe in for a long, long time, the slow, tentative return of trust. The wind whipped across the open plain as Cash Mercer hammered the last board into the corral fence. The sun beat down like a curse, baking the earth into a cracked mosaic. Behind him, Josie was kneeling by her vegetable patch, her hands caked with soil, sweat glistening at her brow. It had been nearly 2 months since he took her, and a broken girl sold like cattle at auction. She spoke more now, laughed sometimes, even sang beneath her breath. Her garden was starting to bloom. That peace shattered in the distance hooves. 3 riders. Cash's head lifted, his jaw tightening. Josie froze. She knew that sound, and she knew the look in his eyes. Danger was coming. The lead rider was a squat man in a dusty gray coat, his mustache curled with arrogance. Benton Hayes, a rancher from Bitter Creek, and worse, the man who had tried to buy Josie and got outbid. The 2 behind him were lean, mean-looking, and armed. "Well, well," Benton drawled, reining in his horse just outside the fence. "Didn't figure you for the babysitting type, Cash. Thought you preferred your solitude." Cash didn't move. "You're not welcome here." Benton's eyes flicked to Josie, then back to Cash. "Girl belongs to me. Bought her fair before your noble streak kicked in. What do you say we settle this civil?" Josie stood slowly behind the fence. She didn't speak, but her hand reached for the hoe she'd been using. Cash stepped between them. "She's no one's property. Not mine. Not yours." Benton chuckled, mean and low. "That ain't how the law sees it. I got papers." Cash took a step closer. "Then let the law come. You set foot past that fence and you'll answer to me." The tension snapped like a dry twig. One of the men beside Benton reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, Cash had his rifle leveled, eyes cold as glacier ice. "Try it." "They didn't." "You gonna shoot me over some dirt rag girl?" Benton spat. Cash didn't blink. "I'd die on this land before I let a bully take what little peace it's finally found." The silence was heavy. Even the wind seemed to hush. Josie stepped forward. Her voice when she spoke was small but steady. "I'm not going back," Benton snorted. "You'll beg to come back when he's through with you." "She's free," Cash growled, voice shaking with more than anger. "And I don't care what you paid. I'll bury that debt with you if I have to." Something in his tone made even the riders hesitate. Benton scowled but pulled on his reins. "You'll regret this." "I already have enough regrets," Cash replied. They rode off, swallowed by dust. Josie came to his side, her hands trembling. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said, "because no one ever did it for me." And in that moment she realized she was no longer alone, and neither was he. The wind that once howled through the canyons now hummed gently across the prairie, brushing against the modest cabin where Cash Mercer and Josie now lived. It had been nearly 3 months since he pulled her from the cruelty of that auction block. What began as a desperate rescue had slowly become something far more fragile and complicated, a quiet rebuilding of 2 fractured souls. Cash still rose before dawn, tending to the land like a man carrying penance in every footstep. He spoke little, but his actions were steady, dependable. Josie had learned to read his silences to find comfort in the routine. She no longer flinched when he passed by her shoulder or froze at the sound of a slammed door. The cabin, once filled only with Cash's solitude, now echoed with the gentle rhythm of healing, the scrape of a spoon in a pot, the soft hum of Josie's voice as she worked in the small garden she'd coaxed from the dry ground. Each day brought new trust, however slight. She'd begun to mend his shirts without being asked, and he left kindling by the fireplace without a word. He didn't hover, didn't ask her to explain herself. And that perhaps was his greatest kindness. One chilly evening, Cash returned from mending fence posts to find a warm scent in the air. Roasted squash and cornbread. Josie had used the very vegetables from her garden, arranged simply but with care. She didn't wait for thanks, only slid the plate toward him and sat across the rough-hewn table, her eyes avoiding his. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she replied quietly, "but I wanted to." Cash took a bite, and the warmth of it spread not just through his chest, but somewhere deeper. The silence between them wasn't awkward now. It was peaceful. Later that night, she stepped out to the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and Cash joined her, handing her a tin cup of warm cider. They stood side by side, watching the stars blink to life. She pointed up. "What's that one, Orion?" he said. "Hunter." She nodded. "He looks lonely." Cash didn't answer at first, then softly, "Most of the strong ones are." Josie looked at him then, not as a savior, not even as a stranger, but as a man who carried grief the way she carried shame. Slowly, she reached out her hand, resting lightly on his. He didn't pull away. Inside, the fire glowed softly through the cabin windows. The table still held crumbs from their meal. Her sewing kit was open near the hearth. His rifle leaned by the door untouched. They were two people shaped by pain, stitched together not by romance, but by quiet understanding. Cash looked down at her hand in his, then at her upturned face. "You feel safe here?" he asked. "For the first time in a long while," she whispered. "I do." And as the wind stirred the prairie grass in gentle waves, Cash allowed himself a rare thought. Maybe safety wasn't a place, maybe it was a person. The afternoon heat hung over the prairie like a warning, still and suffocating. Josie was tending to the carrots, her hands deep in the soil, when the low thunder of hooves broke the stillness. She stiffened. Behind her, Cash emerged from the barn, a coil of rope still in his hand, his body already taut with tension. A single rider crested the rise, Malcolm Crowder, flanked by two dusty men with hard eyes and twitching fingers. Josie didn't need to hear his voice to feel the familiar surge of fear crawl up her spine. Her hands clenched around the garden hoe as she stood, dirt streaked on her arms like war paint. "Well, well," Crowder called, reining in his horse with an arrogant tug. "Didn't think I'd find my runaway girl playing house on a dirt farm." Cash took a step forward, standing between her and the mounted men. "She's not your girl," he said, voice low and steady, "and she's not running anymore." Crowder laughed, cruel and amused. "You really think sheltering damaged goods makes you a hero, Mercer?" His gaze shifted to Josie. "She was mine by law, bought and paid. That contract don't vanish because you felt sorry for her." Cash didn't blink. "That contract was built on fear and shame, and I ain't letting you use those tools anymore." One of Crowder's men began to dismount. Cash's hand dropped near his side, but he didn't reach for a weapon. "Not yet." "I said she's not going with you," he repeated. "She's not worth it," Crowder sneered. "You're risking blood for nothing." Cash stepped closer. "She's worth it to me." The words hit harder than any fist. Josie, still frozen by the garden patch, felt her knees weaken. No one had said that before. Not once. Crowder scoffed and shifted, reaching for something in his coat. Whether a document or a weapon, Cash didn't wait to find out. In a heartbeat he moved. The rope he'd been holding uncoiled fast, slapping around Crowder's wrist and yanking him off balance. His horse bucked, throwing him hard into the dirt. His men hesitated, startled by the swiftness, then backed off as Cash loomed over their boss, boots planted firm. "This land," Cash said, voice like thunder, "isn't just mine. It's hers now, too. You want to come back, you better bring more than words." Crowder spat dust, his pride more bruised than his body. "You'll regret this, maybe," Cash muttered. "But not today." Josie ran to his side, breath caught in her throat. Cash looked at her, eyes softened now. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." And as Crowder and his men retreated into the haze of dust, something inside Josie shifted. For the first time, someone hadn't just stood up for her. They'd stood with her. The sky broke open with wind, but inside Josie's chest, something steadier had begun to grow. A kind of peace, kind of home. The dust from the altercation settled slowly, a fine grit coating the wooden porch and wind-blown vegetables. Josie still clutched the handle of the garden hoe, her hands trembling not from fear anymore, but from the aftershock of what had just unfolded. Cash stood nearby, his chest rising and falling like the earth itself had exhaled through him. His knuckles were scraped, the collar of his shirt torn, but his eyes were steady, clearer than she'd ever seen them. From the distance came the soot clatter of the sheriff's horse departing with Crowder in custody. The tension that had weighed on the ranch for weeks, pressing down like thunderclouds, was finally breaking apart. In its place was a fragile quiet, a new kind. Josie approached him slowly. "Cash, are you hurt?" He looked at her, really looked. Her hair was tangled with wind, her cheeks streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes were shining with something fierce and gentle. "I'm all right," he said after a pause. "Just tired." She reached up instinctively, wiping a trickle of blood from his brow with her sleeve. He didn't flinch, just leaned slightly into her touch. It was the first time she'd touched someone without fear in years. Inside the cabin, she fetched a bowl of water and a clean cloth. Without a word, she dabbed at the scrapes on his face. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was healing. Her hands worked carefully, and though neither said it aloud, both felt it, the unspoken bond forged not from romance but from shared hardship, trust, and the choice to stand beside one another when it mattered most. As the fire crackled that night and the wind outside shifted westward, Josie sat at the table mending Cash's shirt. Her needle moved in calm, precise motions. And he watched from his chair across the room, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. The cabin felt different now, less like a bunker against the world and more like shelter. From the chaos, from the past. Cash glanced at the small garden outside the window, the neat rows of squash and beans she'd nurtured from the stubborn earth. Her laughter, still rare, had begun to visit the cabin more often. Like an old friend peeking around the door. "You've made this place better," he said, voice gruff but genuine. Josie looked up, startled. "You made it safe first," he nodded once. "Maybe we did both. It wasn't a love story in the ordinary sense. There were no grand declarations or stolen kisses in the moonlight. But in the way she warmed bread by the hearth before he came in from work, or the way he added a second rocking chair to the porch without comment, something was being built, slowly, carefully. When Josie looked at Cash now, she saw not just the man who had saved her from humiliation or protected her from Crowder's cruelty. She saw a man who had once been lost himself, and who now dared, even if cautiously, to hope again. And Cash, when he watched Josie gently close the shutters against the night, no longer saw a burden or a reminder of a fight. He saw strength, quiet grace, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected. A life rebuilt not from what had been broken, but from what had endured. together. The days that followed the confrontation with Crowder settled into a rhythm not of fear or silence, but of something gentler. Each sunrise brought with it a kind of stillness that neither Cash nor Josie dared name. But it was there in the shared glances over morning coffee, in the way Josie now left a folded rag for him beside the basin, in the way he brought in extra firewood without being asked. Josie's garden had flourished. Squash vines curled over the edges of the beds, and green beans reached toward the sky like hopeful arms. The cabin, once dry and cold, began to change too. A colorful quilt from the trading post now lay across the bed, and herbs hung drying from the rafters, filling the air with rosemary and mint. The walls that had echoed with emptiness were slowly learning to carry warmth. Cash had stopped waiting for her to leave. She had stopped assuming he'd send her away. One evening, after a long day of repairs on the barn roof, they sat side by side on the porch, not speaking, just watching the sky burn orange and lavender as the sun dipped behind the hills. Josie's fingers were stained from tomatoes. Cash's palms blistered from the hammer. But neither noticed the ache. Their silences had grown comfortable. "Wasn't sure I'd ever want someone here again," Cash said after a long while. "Wasn't sure I could." Josie looked at him, surprised by his openness. "And now he didn't turn his head. Now I check the stove in the morning to see if your bread's baking. I wait to hear you humming while you work. I find myself listening for things I thought I never wanted again." Josie's eyes burned, but she didn't look away. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere. Just move from one place to the next, hoping not to be noticed too much." Cash finally met her gaze. "You're not passing through, Josie. You're part of this place now." A silence settled between them, rich and full. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The table held 2 mugs instead of 1. On the wall, Cash had hung an old horseshoe above the door, something his late wife once believed brought good luck. He hadn't touched it in years until Josie arrived. The grief still lived inside him. That wouldn't go away. He still touched the locket at his chest on hard days. But now, when he did, it wasn't out of despair. It was remembrance and acceptance. Josie no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. She had begun to laugh. Really laugh once when Cash got chased by a territorial goose near the stream. He hadn't minded. It was the first time her joy filled the air like sunlight. They hadn't spoken of the future, but somehow it was already here, growing in the soil, steeping in the tea, lingering in the stillness between heartbeats. A life, built quietly, together. Spring came late to the plains that year. The thaw crept in shyly, melting the last frost from the edges of the fields, coaxing green shoots from the tired soil. Inside the small cabin, the changes were just as quiet, but no less profound. Cash Mercer rose early as always, but now there was warmth in his routine. 2 coffee cups sat by the stove, one slightly smaller than the other. Josie's blanket, hand-stitched and faded, lay folded neatly across the back of his chair. Her presence had settled into the house like the dawn, slow, steady, undeniable. They had weathered storms together, both literal and not. The confrontation with Crowder had left bruises that ran deeper than skin, but since then something between them had shifted. Cash no longer looked at Josie with guarded caution. Instead, his eyes held something quieter, reverence maybe, or peace. Josie had stopped asking when she'd need to leave. She no longer packed her things before every trip to town. Her steps had changed less, like someone walking on borrowed land, more like someone who had laid down roots. One morning, as Cash repaired the corral fence, Josie walked out with a plate of biscuits still warm. "You missed breakfast," she said, setting them down on a nearby post. He looked up, sweat beading on his brow, and gave her a rare smutty. "Didn't know I'd miss it?" She hesitated. "You've been quieter lately." Cash straightened, glancing toward the house. Been thinking, that's all. About... He wiped his hands on his trousers and met her eyes. About what it means to let go of the past without forgetting it. About what it means to build something new. Josie felt her heart beat loud in her chest. And have you figured it out? He nodded slowly. I think it starts with knowing you're not alone anymore. She didn't speak, just stood there, tears stinging the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the weight of being seen. That night after supper they sat on the porch watching the moon rise. Josie held a small tin in her hands. Inside it were seeds, sunflower, lavender, and marigold. I want to plant something for real, she said. Something just for beauty. Cash didn't ask why. He only said, we'll make room. It wasn't romance in the way stories told it. No declarations, no kisses under the stars, but there was a rhythm to their life now, one of shared silence, of lingering glances, of two hands brushing over the same table as they reached for the bread. Josie no longer felt like someone rescued, and Cash no longer felt like someone left behind. What they had wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, but it was the kind of love that holds steady when the wind blows, when the world turns cold, and when spring finally comes again. At its core, this story is a quiet testament to the redemptive power of kindness, respect, and quiet resilience. It reminds us that healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in small acts of care and steady presence, and in the courage to stand beside someone when the world turns against them. Cash and Josie, both scarred by loss and rejection, find strength not in fixing each other, but in simply choosing not to leave. Their journey teaches us that dignity can be restored not through pity but through recognition, by seeing someone not as broken but as worthy. In life we often pass people carrying silent burdens. What we offer, a moment of patience, a space to be seen, a choice to protect rather than judge, can be the lifeline they didn't know they needed. This story also urges us to look beyond appearances and assumptions, to listen with empathy, and to build connection not out of obligation but from shared humanity. In a world that rushes and discards, true redemption lies in slowing down, reaching out and standing up, especially when no one else will. If this story moved your heart, if you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the power of choosing kindness in a harsh world, we invite you to stand with us. Don't forget to like this video if the story stayed with you. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of healing, redemption, and the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support helps keep these stories alive.